So tonight, it is my great pleasure to introduce Rick Britton. And I know I'm Punky File. And I am no longer chairman of the Education Committee, but I am chairman of the Program Committee. So at any rate, many of you know Rick Britton. You've attended many of his classes, and he is an all-time Charlottesville favorite. But there might be a few things you don't know about him, and I hope that I can share those with you tonight. He is a popular teacher who not only teaches classes on Virginia's amazing history, but he is also a cartographer, illustrating maps for books and websites. In addition to writing and teaching, he is the owner of Navigator Tours, specializing in Charlottesville history, Civil War battlefields, and tours of presidential estates. For his groups, large and small, he weaves a wonderfully rich tapestry of colorful people, momentous events, and long-forgotten anecdotes. He makes history come alive. In his role as a cartographer, he employs the same hand-drawn techniques and symbols used by the map illustrators of the 18th and 19th centuries. The results are, his cartography has the feel of history, which cannot be replicated by using a computer. And it produces cartography that is more relevant and valuable to the book in which it appears. Over the years, Rick has illustrated maps for many of the world's largest publishing companies, including Random House, Simon & Schuster, Oxford University Press, Cambridge University Press, and of course, University Press of Virginia. Some of his books, he's a prolific writer, and some of his books include Jefferson, a Monticello Sampler, and Albemarle and Charlottesville, an illustrated history of the first 150 years of Charlottesville. And this is sort of an outlier. The Sea of Trolls with Nancy Farmer, and Rick did the maps, and this is a fantasy novel for children, which is actually part of a trilogy. And then, of course, on the downtown mall. And he has authored many articles, and I mean so many. But I just picked a few that might pique your interest. How the West Wasn't Won, Man versus Mosquitoes, How Walter Reed Secured His Place in Medical History, The Aviator, about World War I, The Ins and Outs of Historic Lodgings and Their Descendants, which brings us to tonight's topic, traveling in early Albemarle. Rick Britton. There will be an opportunity for questions and answers after Rick's talk. Okay. Oh, well.
Testing, 1, 2.
You didn't tell us that.
Let's see, maybe we could just turn it to the side. Will that work? You can hear me just fine, right?
Yes.
I'm going to go sit down.
Okay. Well, good afternoon. It's great to see so many people here and to see, in particular, so many familiar faces. This one was written originally about 4 or 5 years ago. It's been revised many times. It's called Traveling Early Albemarle. Getting about in early Albemarle County was no easy matter, as witnessed by the following account, penned by the Marquis de Chastellux, of a spring 1782 visit. A major general in the French expeditionary force that had made up half the victorious Allied army at the siege of Yorktown, Chastellux was also a talented man of letters, a member of the French Academy. After a night's stay at Boswell's Tavern near Charlottesville, which Chastellux described as, quote-unquote, little prepared to receive strangers, he set out, quote, the next morning at 8 o'clock, having learned nothing in this house worthy of remark. We were now approaching a chain of mountains called the Southwest Mountains, because they are the first you meet traveling westward. As the country was much covered with woods, we had a view of them, but very seldom, and traveled a long time without seeing any habitation, at times greatly perplexed to choose among the different roads which crossed each other. The difficulty of finding roads in this country is not to be conceived. The roads, which are through the woods, not being kept in repair, as soon as one is in bad order, another is made in the same manner. That is, merely by felling the trees. Without a compass, it's impossible to have the least idea of the course you are steering. The distances, too, are uncertain, as they are not measured. No two accounts resemble each other. You need to remember, this is a well-educated European who's writing about a backwater part of Virginia. Bad roads, bad directions, and indifferent and uninteresting public houses, not necessarily the impression we have nowadays of what visitors to our fair Albemarle encountered in the early years. Obviously, these problems are now greatly improved. This presentation focuses on traveling through early Albemarle, navigating the rivers, the first roads and trails, and what the original taverns were like. In order to proceed chronologically, of course, it's necessary to commence with our region's first mode of transportation, its watercourses. Other than for the scenic beauty and uses for recreation, the Rivanna River is little noted today. In the early years, of course, the Rivanna played a major role in the central Piedmont's economic growth, collecting the waters that wash the eastern face of the ancient Blue Ridge Mountains. It flows from northern Albemarle past Charlottesville, then bursts through the southwest mountains at the base of Monticello and Pantops Mountains. After traversing Fluvanna County, the Rivanna joins with the mighty James at Columbia on its way to Richmond. Beyond lie the Chesapeake Bay, of course, and the Atlantic Ocean. Central Virginia's earliest inhabitants rode the waters of the Rivanna countless ages before the arrival of the Europeans. The earliest evidence of human existence in present-day Albemarle County, by the way, dates back approximately 12,000 years. In canoes, I thought that might surprise some folks. In canoes, the native Virginians maneuvered the numerous rapids and bends. For this type of transportation, the dugout canoe was ideal. It drew little water, moved rapidly, and was easy to steer. As well as can be determined, these Aborigines made no direct improvements to navigation on the Rivanna. They did, however, build fish dams, or weir dams, which of course had the same effect by routing the various streams into central channels. European culture waded ashore in Tidewater, Virginia, and slowly made its way up the navigable estuaries and rivers. Along with the Europeans, of course, came the mass cultivation of tobacco, the evil weed that captured and addicted the minds of Western Europe. The crop promised a quick return on investment, but badly depleted the soil. Within but a few years, the planters were forced to look to the west for new lands. As tobacco forged into the fertile wilderness of Virginia, the need arose for organized transportation. The valuable crop had to get to market, and there was a lot of money to be made on tobacco. The luxuries of civilization had to be brought into the interior. And here's a little aside that I found interesting, just to give you an idea of the massive size of Virginia's tobacco economy. Here are a few figures. First product was shipped to England in 1614. So they wasted very little time getting around to tobacco. By 1622, the annual total had risen to 60,000 pounds. In 1700, 20 million pounds of tobacco was exported from Virginia. Thomas Jefferson understood the needs of the growing economy and set about to satisfy them. In 1765, he and a group of others subscribed 200 pounds to make improvements on the Rivanna. The river was surveyed and the water channel perfected by dredging and removing trees and large rocks. Proudly, Jefferson later listed this endeavor as his first service to the public. And what's fascinating is, of course, Jefferson in 1765 was only 22 years old. In his first book, Notes on the State of Virginia, issued in London in 1787, he described the Rivanna as, quote, navigable for canoes and bateaux to its intersection with the Southwest Mountains, which is about 22 miles, and may easily be open to navigation through those mountains to its fork above Charlottesville. When he mentions 22 miles, he means upriver from the present-day site of Columbia. Improvements to the river coincided with improvements to the mode of transport. Tobacco, like other products ready for shipment, was packed into hogsheads, large casks 4 feet tall and about 30 inches across. In liquid measurement, a hogshead held just over 60 gallons. Packed solid with tobacco, a hogshead normally weighed 800 to 1,000 pounds. That's a lot of tobacco. The first hogsheads from Albemarle were rolled to market. An axle was sometimes inserted lengthwise through the cask with leader poles attached at either end. A draft horse or a few strong men, therefore, could pull the hefty hogshead along. The roadways of early central Virginia, however, were unreliable and unsuitable as avenues to market. The planters and merchants turned to water transport, therefore, as the best and most economical method. But how? By what means? Robert Rose, the Reverend Robert Rose, has been credited with an innovation that first hit the waters of the Rivanna and James Rivers in the mid-1700s. The idea of lashing 2 long canoes side by side. Fashioned from 50-foot long logs and held alongside each other with pins and crossbeams, these canoes were capable of carrying up to 8 hogsheads. For 20 years, tobacco, as well as other products, floated down the Rivanna on these double canoes, guided, of course, by enslaved African-American watermen. A severe flood in 1771 made it painfully obvious that a more stable vessel was required. In 1775, the Rucker brothers, led by Anthony Rucker the Elder, introduced a flat-bottom boat built of lumber that perfectly fit the bill. Very different from any vessel previously used on the rivers of Virginia, the James River bateau, or tobacco boat, was 50 to 60 feet long and could float 11 hogsheads of tobacco while drawing only 1 foot of water. Because of the size of the shipment and the vessel, however, 3 watermen were required. 1 man would steer while the others poled along the sides. Rucker's bateau boat design was successfully patented many years later. The earliest known reference to the bateau comes from the local bateau, comes from Thomas Jefferson's account book, dated April 19, 1775. Jefferson was present at the first launching. Jefferson was everywhere. He was present at the first launching, and 46 years later, he was witness to the successful patenting of the bateau by Rucker's heirs. Unfortunately, none of the original bateaus exist. Some remains were uncovered by construction workers at the site of the James River and Kanawha Canal Basin at Richmond. And just in case anybody is wondering, Ruckersville was founded by Huguenot John Rucker, perhaps a distant relative of these Rucker brothers. With a steady stream of product traveling down the Rivanna, it was inevitable that a portion would be lost to the current and the problems of navigation. The planters wanted more improvements made. The Rivanna Navigation Company was formed in 1805 to remedy this situation. Over the next few years, the organization created sluices, or artificial channels, in the river and dug out and perfected those already in existence. Wing dams were also constructed at more than 25 difficult-to-navigate sites, such as fords and shoals. These obstructions were often just downstream from a creek's confluence with the Rivanna. The collision, I find this fascinating, the collision of waters caused the two streams to drop their sediment, thus building up the river bottom and creating a shallow area. A wing dam of piled rocks at these difficult places would raise the level of water, enabling the bateau to get by. Two wing dams, one reaching out from each bank, created a sluice. Upstream from Charlottesville, the company improved the river to Brook Mills on the North Fork, and eventually all the way to Rio Mills and hydraulic mills on the South Fork. I don't think people realize, but bateaux were coming all the way up the Rivanna to hydraulic mills, which seems pretty amazing. And wing dams and sluices weren't the only improvements constructed by the Rivanna Navigation Company. Mill dams were already in existence on the Rivanna, and each was required to have its own lock. When the company came along, it took over the upkeep on these locks. By 1818, the navigation on the Rivanna incorporated 7 wooden locks and numerous short canals. Because of these improvements, towns and warehouse stops started popping up along the Rivanna River. Milton, a few miles downstream of Charlottesville, became the quote-unquote port of Albemarle, a state tobacco inspection station along with a row of tobacco warehouses lined the shore. When the head of navigation was extended past Charlottesville, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, Rio Mills, hydraulic mills, the little way stop lost its importance. At the confluence of the Rivanna with the James, another inspection station, Rivanna Warehouse, was established. It later grew into the canal town of Columbia. And has anybody been to Columbia lately? I haven't been in years and years. And I'm wondering, does it still exist? Okay, because the last time I went through, everything just seemed to be crumbling.
Up on the hill, there's some houses that people actually live in.
Still up the hill?
Route 6, it's just abandoned building.
Right, that's what I thought, because right on Route 6 there, right near the bridge, there are these old hotels, and they had been abandoned, obviously. What a shame. The place is really amazing. It's in a really amazing spot. Now I've lost my place. Bernardsburg lay on the river in northwest Fluvanna County on the Rivanna River. It boasted a state tobacco warehouse and one of the region's first newspapers. The riverine life of a waterman captured the public imagination. But in reality, the work was extremely hard. At high water, it was easy enough to quote-unquote float down with the stream. But to get the large vessels back upriver, they had to be poled. This meant forcing the craft against the flow of water. Dr. George William Bagby, this guy could really write, a mid-19th century author and publisher, penned the following description of the Virginia boatman's lot. Quote, "His was a hardy calling, demanding skill, courage, and strength in a high degree. I can see him now striding the plank that ran along the gunwale to afford him footing, his long iron-shod pole trailing in the water behind him. A stalwart, jolly, courageous set they were, plying the pole all day, hauling into shore at night to rest, to eat, to play the banjo, and to snatch a few hours of profound, blissful sleep." Unquote. The downriver trips carried tobacco, Albemarle's first and most profitable product, of course, to Richmond, the first leg of its transshipment to Western Europe. Other products, too, of course, made this 70-mile float to the state capital. Starting in the 1790s, wheat slowly began replacing tobacco as Central Virginia's crop of choice. Oftentimes, the bateau made the journey to Richmond in groups of 3. Once offloaded, 2 of the bateaux would be sold for lumber, and the third would return laden with the 3 crews and items desperately needed in the backwater country. This up cargo, as it was called, would often include sacks of salt, bags of coffee, barrels of sugar, cakes, molasses, And of course, we can't forget whiskey. In the 1830s, the continued economic growth of the central Piedmont made more navigational improvements to the Rivanna necessary. The sluice system was abandoned in favor of more locks and dams. In some cases, canals were constructed in order to bypass mill dams where the fall was too great. All in all, an upriver trip from Columbia on the James to Moore's Ford at Charlottesville made use of 19 locks and 14 dams, that by the 1830s. 20 years later, in the 1850s, the Rivanna Navigation Company set about to enlarge their locks. The organization constructed much bigger locks built of closely set stone and added 6 more miles of canals. These were accompanied by earthen towpaths so that the heavier vessels could be pulled upriver by horse and mule power. Many of these works, especially at Palmyra on the Rivanna, can still be seen. The navigation system along the Rivanna persisted just into the 20th century, although its last few years saw little service. As can be imagined, the mode of transportation that once carried the commerce of Albemarle County and a good portion of the Shenandoah Valley was eventually replaced by the railroad. Ironically, the last major service performed by the Rivanna canals was bringing up the rails and ties of the Virginia Airline Railroad. Kind of sad when you think about it. The first version of Albemarle County, called Big Albemarle. Have y'all heard of Big Albemarle? Get this. Big Albemarle was carved from Goochland County in 1744. It included much of the James River Valley above the falls. Present-day Albemarle, of course, but also the counties of Fluvanna, Buckingham, Nelson, and Amherst, as well as much of Appomattox and part of Campbell counties. These other jurisdictions were eventually all cut from Albemarle County by 1777, during the American Revolution. When Big Albemarle was organized, small settlements had already been in existence. This according to the Reverend Edgar Woods, really the first historian of Albemarle County history. For 12 or 13 years, Williamsburg being the capital of the colony and its public business being transacted there, it was natural that the first great roads of the country should tend in that direction, to Williamsburg. One was opened along the James River. This was the River Road, authorized in 1731. Piercing the dense woods on the north bank of the James and Rivanna rivers, it connected Goochland Courthouse with southern Albemarle County. The main track leading to the more northerly portions of the county, however, of course, was the Three Notch Road, an already existing Native American trail that was co-opted by Virginia's European settlers. Three Notch Road, or Three Chop Road, was named for the distinctive markings cut into its flanking trees at regular intervals for the benefit of pre-GPS wayfarers. Where would we be without GPS? As early as 1737, it possessed milestones or numbered trees to further aid the travelers. This well-known thoroughfare, for the most part, approximating today's Route 250, built in the 1930s, blazed west from Westham, near Richmond, through Goochland and Fluvanna counties. Following the watershed between the South Anna and the James, it crossed the Albemarle County line, where its modern counterpart does, not far from Boyd's Tavern, came up the Rivanna on its north side, crossed at Secretary's Ford, coincided with what is now Main Street of Charlottesville, then heading west toward the Blue Ridge, crossed Ivy Creek and Meacham's River. It's there that Three Notch Road diverged from Route 250. Instead of striking the mountain at Rockfish Gap, this old byway headed in a straight line to Jarman's Gap, considerably north of Rockfish. And when you think about it, it's exactly where, I think it's Duners? Yes. Where 250 takes that left turn, and going straight ahead, you'll go directly into Crozet. That's the old Three Notch Road, going straight ahead. Jack Jewett Jr., on his famous ride from Louisa County the night of June 3rd, 1781, made good use of this well-marked road to beat British Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton, the hated Bannister Tarleton, to Monticello and Charlottesville. Virginia history would have been much different if he hadn't. Another early Albemarle byway was the Buck Mountain Road. Really, according to Woods, quote, a series of connecting roads which start from Rockfish Gap, bend along the base of the Blue Ridge to Whitehall, pass over Mormons River at Millington to Free Union and Earlysville, cross the North Fork of the Rivanna, and enter the Barbersville Road at Stony Point, unquote. When Charlottesville became the county seat in 1762, it of course became the center of the county road net. Skirting the base of the Southwest Mountains, the Barbersville Road was one of the outlets leading north. Heading to the northwest, Barracks Road, of course, was laid out during the American Revolution. Albemarle's earlier settlers were very practical, and I get a lot of questions about the names of roads, and especially Rio Road. Albemarle's earliest settlers were very practical when it came to naming roads. Barracks Road, therefore, was the track you take from Charlottesville when traveling to the barracks where the British and Hessian prisoners of war were quartered. It started from the west end of High Street, passed over Preston Heights, north of the University of Virginia, and continued to the ridge east of Ivy Creek, descended to the ford of the creek, past the old Ivy Creek Church. Charlottesville's outlets to the south were established very early. The old Lynchburg Road, for example, has been in use from the first settlement of the town. Starting at the foot of Vinegar Hill, it reached to the top of the ridge, and my manuscript used to say, at the site of the Lewis and Clark statue. Now he can give directions. You turned right where the Lewis and Clark statue used to be. Now it says, reach the top of the ridge at the previous site of the Lewis and Clark statue, then continued south past places whose names we no longer recognize. Haggard's, West Sawmill Run, Old Forge, and Andrew Hart's store. The county's first turnpike was laid out in 1806, called Brown's Turnpike. It crossed the Blue Ridge at Brown's Gap, descended Brown's Cove, and joined the Three-Notch Road at Meacham's Depot. Other turnpikes followed in the 1830s. One was the Stanton and James River, connecting the Shenandoah Valley with the river town of Scottsville and its commercially vital James River Kanawha Canal. In later years, it was planked. The next was the Blue Ridge and Rivanna Turnpike, which ran from Meriwether's Bridge on the Rivanna at the Woolen Mills to Brooksville in western Albemarle at the base of the mountains. Its construction, when you think about it, it makes sense. Its construction occasioned the laying out of the straight road from the Woolen Mills to the east end of Market Street. If you look on a map of Charlottesville, it's perfectly straight, that road. The Harrisonburg and Charlottesville Turnpike crossed the Blue Ridge at Swift Run Gap, entered the county at Nortonsville, fell into the Buck Mountain Road west of Earlysville, and ran from there through Rio Mills and Cochran's Mill to Charlottesville. Up through the mid-1800s, though, the roads and turnpikes, though graced with names, were really rough and tumble affairs. Heavily rutted, perpetually unimproved, they guided travelers through the sparsely populated countryside. The scenery must have been breathtaking, but don't think the traveling was easy. In the era before passenger trains, the stagecoach reigned supreme. Visitors to Central Virginia typically came packed aboard the Fredericksburg or Richmond stage, their trunks lashed behind and on top with mud-splattered leather belts. In the 1820s, the stagecoach trip from Richmond to Charlottesville took over 18 hours. Those were the days, huh? When Charles Dickens rode the stage through Virginia in the 1840s, the trip was anything but pleasant. Quote, "At one time," he wrote, "we were all flung together in a heap at the bottom of the coach. And at another, we were crushing our heads against the roof. Never was the coach in any position, attitude, or kind of motion to which we were accustomed in coaches." And as you can imagine, those folks not accustomed to stagecoach travel suffered terribly. For the 18th and 19th century version of motion sickness, called stage sickness, opium was often prescribed. Opium. So you can just sleep through the whole trip. What made traveling bearable? Why, the taverns, of course. The taverns, inns, and ordinaries, the names were somewhat interchangeable, provided the rest, food, and beverages along the route. They were the intermittent way stations, the punctuations, so to speak, between the long stretches of infamously bad Virginia road. Invaluable to the weary passengers, the taverns of Central Virginia were built, of course, along the main stagecoach routes. And it was rare to journey 20 miles along one of those routes without encountering one. The sight of a tavern at the next rise must certainly have relieved the rattled passengers. Built primarily to host travelers, taverns in colonial times also served their respective communities as informal meeting halls. When a county seat was founded, the public buildings naturally were the first constructed. Taverns were usually the next to go up. In many villages and hamlets, the tavern served as a public building, and magistrate trials and public meetings were often held in them. In towns fortunate enough to have a public building, the tavern was where people went to refresh themselves after attending a long function in the meeting house. Beer was the refreshment preferred by these early tavern goers, although stronger elixirs were certainly available. Of these, rum was the most popular, the most expensive variety having been imported from the West Indies. Straight rum was the drink of the working class. Grog, watered down rum, was served in the lowliest of taverns, while the better establishments offered punch. That's rum flavored with the rinds and juices of lemons, limes, and even oranges. To this tasty concoction was added heaps of white or brown sugar. Tavern licenses were freely issued if the owner promised to maintain good order and good rule. So that's all you had to do here, is just promise that. That seemed to hold true for Albemarle County, for by 1748, within 4 years of the county's placement on the map, licenses had been issued for just over 10 ordinaries. Of these first businesses, Hugh McGarrah opened one not far from Afton, while Daniel Scott and John Lewis each operated taverns, serving up spirits at the courthouse. So basically we got a courthouse and 2 taverns right across the way. Not to be outdone, William Battersby set up one opposite the courthouse, kind of catty-corner from the courthouse. The various titles given to these stopover watering holes have caused some confusion over the years. The names tavern, inn, and ordinary, although referring to the same type of establishment, seem to have had regional affiliations. After the Revolution, some regions rejected the word inn because of its English associations. Tavern usually prevailed in New England. In the South, the most common name was ordinary. In colonial times, ordinaries, following the British custom, and I just looked this up the other day, I find this fascinating. These were taverns or eating houses wherein meals were served at regular advertised times, and they were served in the ordinary way, meaning, in today's lingo, family style. One source referred to ordinaries as crude places where the clientele simply slept on the floor in their clothes. In Central Virginia, however, tavern seems to have held sway. These taverns had bedrooms where often one was set aside for the women and one for the men. In these situations, it was fairly common to expect several tavern customers, and sometimes 4 or 5, to share the same bed. Of course, everyone kept their clothes on. We're talking about strangers, right? But it was really important that the men, especially, remove their footwear. One of the British prisoners here during the American Revolution, Major Thomas Anbury, wrote the following regarding our area's countryside taverns. Quote, "They consist of a little house placed in a solitary situation in the middle of the woods, and the usual method of describing the roads is, quote, from such an ordinary house to such a one, so many miles." So you can keep track of how far apart the taverns or ordinaries were. "The entertainment you meet with is very poor. Indeed, you are seldom able to procure any other fare than eggs and bacon with Indian hoe cake, and at many of them, not even that. The only liquors are peach brandy and whiskey. They are not remiss, however, in making pretty exorbitant charges." End quote. Naturally, they're going to charge a British officer more money. I mean, that's silly for him to expect anything less. Note that in this quote, the use of the word entertainment to Anbury and all the others of his generation, it meant food, drink, and accommodations. Not music, not dancing. Swan Tavern was constructed in the backwater town of Charlottesville in the mid-1770s by Jack Jewett Sr., father to express rider Jack Jewett Jr. It sat at the corner of Jefferson and Park. Directly in front of the courthouse, its claim to fame came from its use by the Virginia legislature during the Revolution in May and early June of 1781. Of course, when Jefferson and the entire government of Virginia fled Richmond, and Charlottesville for a brief time became the state capital. This act of public service has been disputed by many, but the Virginia State Library contains a document dated June 11, 1781, in which proprietor Jewett requests compensation for damage done to the tavern during the legislative session of the previous month. What did they, like, break tables? Or what were they doing? Barkeeper Jack McCoy was murdered at the Swan in 1808. Supposedly his body was tossed down a nearby well. Local editor James Alexander noted that by the 1820s, the Swan Tavern had become dilapidated, and it only lasted a few more years. The Eagle Tavern was built across from Charlottesville's courthouse shortly after the American Revolution. Over the years, it saw its share of famous guests on the register were listed. And the first two are no big surprise. President James Madison, President James Monroe. No big surprise. But Theodore Roosevelt, as well as Edgar Allan Poe and General Robert E. Lee. In 1822, the Eagle held a special dinner and ball to commemorate George Washington's birthday. The Eagle and the Swan have long gone, but other Central Virginia taverns have survived. Mickey Tavern sits perched on the western slope of Carter's Mountain, a mountain that overlooks Monticello just a few hundred yards from the entrance to Thomas Jefferson's home. The view to the westward over Charlottesville and out to the beautiful Blue Ridge Mountains is superb and particularly striking at night. William Mickey, a former Continental Army corporal, built Mickey Tavern alongside Buck Mountain Road, about 17 miles northwest of its present location in the early 1780s. His father, Scotch John Mickey, had bequeathed him the property fed by a natural spring. William received his tavern-keeping license in 1784. While Charlottesvillians and visiting French major generals may have looked down their noses at our county ordinaries, William Mickey's accommodations rivaled the best anywhere. The two-story tavern featured and still features an upstairs assembly room. Big enough for dances and church services, it functioned as the area's local social center. And it had other uses as well. Itinerant, I find this amusing, itinerant doctors and dentists, as well as other traveling businessmen and entertainers, paid Mickey for the use of this space. I know, I'll go down and get liquored up, then I'll be ready for the dentist. Mickey Tavern also served as a makeshift post office and school. Mickey Tavern continued hosting guests until the mid-1800s. By the Civil War, however, thanks in part to the advent of the railroads, stagecoach travel had greatly fallen off, as you can imagine. The structure then became the Mickey's private home. In 1910, the tavern, which was starting to show its age, was sold out of the Mickey family at an estate auction. In 1927, Mrs. Mark Henderson, a local businesswoman, purchased Mickey Tavern with the idea of establishing it as a museum for her large collection of antiques. In order to take advantage of Albemarle's rapidly growing tourist trade, Monticello had just opened for visitation. Mrs. Henderson moved Mickey Tavern to Carter's Mountain, the eminence Jefferson called Monte Alto. To facilitate the 17-mile journey by truck and horse-drawn wagon and its reconstruction, the tavern's old building elements had been painstakingly dismantled and numbered, so you could easily put it back together. Opened as a museum in 1828, Mickey Tavern was awarded status as a Virginia historic landmark, thanks in large measure to Mrs. Henderson's efforts. Boyd Tavern on State Route 616 in eastern Albemarle was but one of many such establishments on the stage line from Richmond. An adjacent log building housed the bar. Boyd's Tavern post office also stood nearby. Lafayette and his small army camped near Boyd's Tavern during the 1781 campaign, using the position to block British General Charles Lord Cornwallis from penetrating further into the state of Virginia. In the early 20th century, soldiers' initials could still be seen carved into a nearby stand of cypress trees. During Lafayette's triumphal tour in 1824, visiting Virginia, the 67-year-old Marquis was greeted at the Fluvanna County line by the Albemarle Lafayette Guards and escorted to Boyd's for refreshments. What's that? I'm almost there. I'm on the last page. Traveling Albemarle was much different in the 18th and 19th centuries. The region's rivers and streams, after their use by Albemarle's first inhabitants, saw mostly commercial traffic, and that, of course, wasn't guaranteed. Many a bateau boat lost its contents to the Rivanna's tempestuous waters. The early roads, too, were catch-as-catch-can affairs, haphazard tracks through the heavily wooded wilderness. For Albemarle's jostled and road-weary visitors, the taverns offered the only creature comforts available. Some of these guests just needed a good night's rest. Others came to slough off the cold and pass an evening behind a tankard of ale. Sometimes the lodgings were rough, and sometimes the hoe cakes and eggs went down hard. But the taverns were a hotbed of commerce, news, and social interaction, and they left us a legacy rich and fascinating. Thank you.